Title: Fallen Throne, A Swordswoman's Glory. Mom, I'm off to wash the clothes by the creek. A young girl's voice cries out throughout the house. Without waiting for a response, the front door closes with the slight sound of the wind that's been trapped. The young girl, Alora, was off to do her usual chores. As Alora was winding through the mild foot traffic of the morning markets and shops from all over selling little trinkets, she couldn't help but feel excited for what today had entailed. Today, being laundry day, she gets to play in the creek while washing the clothes of her hardworking father and caring mother. Alora was born in the Hesse Kingdom, more specifically, the Gold Vassal State. While not having an education, she knows where she lives, like most commoners under the Gould household. Her father, a tough-looking, hard-working shoemaker, was as gentle as he could be when it came to Alora. When it came to Alora's mother, she was like every other woman of common descent. She was a hard-working housewife who had dinner ready when her husband came home. To Alora, every day felt normal, same as today. She had planned the day to be like any other. Chores by the creek, look around at the pretty jewelry sold by the travelers, try and hassle a snack from the old man running the restaurant near her father's shop, and come home with her father, to a nice-smelling dinner on the table, begging to be eaten, or so she thinks. Today as well felt normal, except for when she got to her father's shop. There was a man, tall, well-dressed, and fat, causing a scene at the entrance. When she was about to hear what the shouting was about, the man turned around in a huff, spinning on the heel of his right foot and disappearing into his fancy carriage, away from Alora's sight. When she reached her father's side, holding his hand, asked what happened. "Nothing," her father said through a slight smile. Turning to Alora, he asked, "So, how was your day? Did old man Jeffrey fall for your tricks?" "Not today, he ran out of snacks." Alora sighed with a slight pout on her face. Alora's father let out a loud bellow of laughter and exclaimed, "Okay, let's go home and snack on whatever your mother has made for us. Hopefully she doesn't try making a new dish, like last time," Alora says jokingly through a smile. As the sun slowly fell on another normal day, Alora, clutching to her father's hand, turns and excitedly tells her father what she has planned for tomorrow, about how she hopes it doesn't rain so she can play in the creek, how she wants to help around the other housewives for a small payment to buy the pretty, green-jeweled necklace that she spotted on last week's journey to wash the clothes. Her father, with pride showing in his eyes at how mature his 10-year-old daughter could be, forms a plan to surprise her. After she makes enough to afford the necklace, he will buy it for her so she can keep her money and buy a nice dress to go with the pretty necklace. When the father-daughter pair reached their home, a shabby, two-story house smashed beside the neighbors' houses that are identical to every house as far as Alora can see. Standing on the doorstep with the door wide open, letting the sweet smell of whatever amazingly delicious, yet surprisingly cheap, delicacy that could be found on the shelves of the market down the road, was a slender, pretty woman in housewear that was as simple as it appeared to be. Alora's mother was standing there with a big grin on her face as she watched her husband swing her daughter around with his hand, as Alora was giggling, swaying back and forth. Alora's mother waved them in, like a lighthouse signaling in a boat. She couldn't help but feel that this is what true happiness feels like. "Hi, Mom!" Alora's voice rang through the streets as she and her father were guided home due to the sweet smell coming from the house, and the even sweeter smile Alora's mother had plastered on her face. As they all hugged, only breaking when Alora's mother ushered them inside to eat, Alora reiterated her plans she had spoken to her father on the way back home, and in a hushed voice, her father excitedly told his plan to Alora's mother as they sat down to enjoy the meal her mother made. As the sun sets and the cheerful talk at dinner turns to the sound of plates clinking together as Alora's parents scramble to clean hurriedly so they can rest after a long day, Alora heads to her room and crawls into bed waiting for her usual story from her father. Right on cue, her father enters holding a worn-out book that looks as if it's been patched multiple times, words fading into the whitish-yellow pages, a spine that's been rest-wrung a few too many times. "You know, this was my favorite book when I was a kid too," Alora's father said with a smile. Alora, hearing it countless times before, smiles and says, "Really?" as to not make her father feel bad. As if rehearsed, Alora's father starts reading. Once upon a time, there was a young boy playing in the fields of a huge castle. He was the prince of the country. While he was playing, he stumbled upon a stone statue of a man holding his sword into the air. Under the statue's feet, a stone had a writing on it. He who reads this, be inspired to hold up your sword for what you believe in, as I was when I was young. As the prince read those words, he felt that he too could be like the statue, a hero who his country could rely on. And so on, the young prince grew up to raise his sword, either a real sword or a metaphoric sword, for the sake of his country's growth. The end. Dad, what does metaphoric mean again? Alora asks. Well, it means when you do something like raise your sword, but there is no sword you're actually raising. Like when you stand up to a bully for one of your friends, you're raising a sword for your friend. Alora's father explains to Alora. Now, no more questions. Alora's father says as he stands up to blow out the candle on the nightstand. Good night, Dad. I love you. Alora blurts before the yawn running up her throat can come out. I love you too. Alora's father says with a slight smile. A few days have passed and Alora's normal everyday schedule has remained the same, except she now works a little with the other women so she could afford her necklace. After several days of this, she has saved up enough to get it. After working tomorrow, Mrs. Foster, a kind, older neighbor, asked her to deliver eggs to her son who lives near the edge of the town. After discussing it over dinner with her parents, Alora has gotten permission. This gives her parents enough time to buy the necklace and scope out a pretty dress to go with it. The next morning, Alora goes out to do her chores first, then she heads to Mrs. Foster's house. She approaches the door and gives it 3 soft knocks, loud enough for Mrs. Foster to hear from her kitchen. Come in, she says with a slight smile on the side of her lips. So, how are your parents? Mrs. Foster asked, trying to make small talk. Alora responds saying, same as always, I guess. They are busy, but still have time to play with me, so I'm happy. That's good, they always seem so busy, but at least you're there to set them straight, huh? Mrs. Foster jokes. Here's the basket, sweetie, remember, the small, blue house without many neighbors, okay? She states, as she points to a small basket atop her dining table. Okay. I'll be back soon. Alora yells out as she runs off in the direction of Mr. Foster's house. Be safe. Mrs. Foster shouts back. Along the way, Alora had a blast seeing parts of town she doesn't get to visit often, waving to new people running their own little shops along the walkways, trying to find the fastest and safest way through a crowd of people so she doesn't break the eggs, and finding kids around her age, who she will keep in mind as potential friends. As she reaches the edge of town, she remembers how Mrs. Foster described the house. A small, blue house without any neighbors. Alora repeats in her head in her best old lady impression. After searching for what felt like an hour to a 10-year-old, but was really only 10 minutes, she finally found it. Alora approached the house's door, a large, brown slab of heavy wood. Alora was sure that it would take at least 10 of her to lift. She knocked 3 times, the same way she knocked for Mrs. Foster. Due to the difference in the door, Alora's knock sounded twice as loud as she hoped for. After a moment, a man, what Alora could only describe as a giant, walked out of the small blue house. Alora, who just couldn't help it, burst out laughing, the loudest laugh she thinks she's ever let out. What's funny? The giant of a man, Mr. Foster, snarls. I'm sorry. Alora, covering her mouth in a split second, uttered, for a giant to walk out of the tiniest house I've ever seen, I just couldn't hold back. Mr. Foster, stunned for a second, roars out an even bigger laugh than Alora and says, Little miss, this is the first time someone's ever said that to my face. As the both of them, standing outside the giant's tiny home, are laughing like maniacs, Mr. Foster cuts through the laughter and invites Alora in, saying, I guess my mother sent you, seeing as you have my mother's basket. Yep. Alora declares, as she sets the basket on the small desk that Mr. Foster pointed at. I keep telling her, if I need something I'll ask, but no, she keeps sending people over. Mr. Foster states through a sigh. Well, at least she keeps in touch with you, making sure you're all right. That's what I want my mom to do when I get older. Alora blurts out. True. I like the way you think, little miss. Mr. Foster says, giggling to himself. I'm Alora. Nice to meet you, she said, holding out her tiny hand to greet the giant, Mr. Foster. I'm Jean Foster, it's nice to meet you too, little miss, said Mr. Foster as he engulfed Alora's tiny hand within his. So, I heard from my mother that you're getting paid by helping around the other wives, making their lives a little easier, right? What's a little miss like you needin' with a good chunk of money? Mr. Foster queried. Well, to buy the necklace I saw by Mr. Jeffrey's restaurant, Alora says through her smile. Why ain't your parents buyin' it for ya? Mr. Foster questions. I don't want them to spend money they need on something small like that, she said while thinking of all the expenses her father pays running the shoe shop in the middle of town. Well, ain't that a mature way to think? Mr. Foster said proudly. Well, get on goin', don't want to make your parents worry, or you don't want some other little girl to take that necklace from ya, do ya? Says Mr. Foster. You're right. I'll come visit again soon, Mr. Foster, bye. Alora says with one foot already out the door, practically running back home. Visit any time you want, yells the gentle giant, Mr. Foster, to the little girl already a stone's throw away from the tiny house. Alora, completely ignoring all of the scenes she saw on the way over, was sprinting into town hoping to make it back to Sean's Antiques, the store she saw the necklace at. With the sun going down, what seemed faster to the young Alora, she was in a race against time, determined to win. She went down every shortcut she could. Eventually, she makes it 10 minutes before Mr. Sean closes and hurriedly looks for the necklace that was displayed in a corner, completely forgotten to almost everyone. As she reaches the box it was supposed to be in, she realizes it was missing just as Mr. Sean approaches behind her. I'm sorry, little Alora, but someone just bought that today. I wish I didn't have to sell it, but the man wanted to surprise his daughter. That's okay, Alora said, slightly disappointed. At least someone gets to be happy that their father thinks so highly of them to get them a present. Mr. Sean, surprised, uttered a reassuring, yeah, someone will be really surprised. Mr. Sean had to fight back the smile that was creeping along his face. Well, I should go back home and let Mom and Dad know that they can use the money now, since the necklace is gone, she said, as she was heading towards the door. You do that, smiled Mr. Sean. As Alora left the shop, her head was down watching her feet slide across the street, wiping slight tears that wanted to roll down her face, as she headed back home instead of normally meeting her father at his shop because it was closed today. As she was about to round the corner to her street, she smelled what she thought was a party where someone was cooking something on a big fire that the town usually has on good weekends. As soon as she rounded the corner towards her parents' house, she saw it. The fire she thought was a group of families enjoying their weekend was actually a giant fire. The fuel for that massive fire, her family's house. When she saw it, she couldn't help but run towards the burning house. When she reached the group of neighbors and onlookers, praying her parents were a part of the mob, she saw it, a sight she desperately didn't want to see. Her parents, dead on the street, not to the fire, but to the massive holes in their torsos. As she fell to her knees crying and screaming out to her parents, wondering who and wondering why, her neighbors who recognized her tried their best to shield her from the gruesome sight, but it was too late. As she looked out to the once loving pair, she saw something that made her jump up and rush to them. A shiny green light, reflecting the fire of a once cheerful household, flashed in the eyes of Alora. She reached out and grabbed the object and let the metal chain flow down off her fingertips, holding a small part of the chain. The now dangling green gemstone necklace felt like a slap to the face for calling what Mr. Sean said. As she fell to her knees once again, she began wailing until she felt a small hand on her back, as Mrs. Foster grabbed her into a hug. Laid in Mrs. Foster's arms, the tears started to run from her eyes. She finally found the words to ask, "Who?" "We don't know, honey," said Mrs. Foster, trying to fight back her own tears. Then, as if the memory hit her like a brick, she remembered the man yelling at her father just days ago. Alora, trying to remember everything about that man, remembers the family crest the man donned on the side of his fancy carriage. "The Gould family," she whispers, recalling stories about them doing this exact same thing to people who inconvenienced them. "Father must have done something to the man that day to piss him off," she mutters to herself. "But, why?" Mrs. Foster utters, "He was the one that was unreasonable." "What?" Alora shouts, "What do you mean? Dad didn't do anything?" "We should go to my house first, sweetie," Mrs. Foster says as she tries to guide Alora through the growing crowd. Alora, getting up to follow Mrs. Foster, put the necklace around her neck and followed as ordered. When the two got to Mrs. Foster's house, they discussed what happened that day. Mrs. Foster reiterated the day that horrid man came to her father's shop. "When he first came in, your father was busy with another man's shoes. When he saw that, he went up to the man and told him to move. Your father, almost finished with the first man, politely asked him to wait, but that irritated the man to no end. He said, 'Why shine a filthy pig's shoes just for him to roll around in the mud?' After hearing this, your father asked him to leave, then the argument went out onto the street. The last thing the man said, before you showed up, is, 'Filthy pig, I'll burn down that pigsty of yours.' I didn't think he was serious at the time. I should have known as soon as I saw the fire." Mrs. Foster bawled. After hearing what happened, the only thing going through Alora's head wasn't grief, but anger. "I have to go," Alora said aloofly. Mrs. Foster, flustered, started to ask, "What dash?" but was cut off by the sound of the door slamming. Alora was gone, off into the cool night.